The dust was the first and last thing you knew of the world. It rose in a fine red cloud from the hooves of the mules and the iron-shod wheels of the wagon, coating Eliza Hart's eyelashes, settling in the creases of her worn cotton dress, and lining her throat with a perpetual grit. It was the color of old blood and new clay, the very substance of the long road through New Mexico territory. For 3 weeks. It had been her constant companion, a silent testament to the miles that separated her from a life that was no longer hers and the uncertain one that lay ahead in a mining town called Copper Gap. Her late husband, a man whose quiet goodness felt like a dream from another lifetime, had always said you could measure a person by how they handled the dust. Did they curse it, or did they understand it was simply the land? Breathing, Eliza tried to breathe with it. She sat straight on the wagon bench, the reins held loosely but capably in her gloved hands, her gaze sweeping across the vast, sun-baked expanse. Beside her, a young man named Billy, whose face was more peach fuzz than beard, hummed a nervous tune. 2 other wagons rattled behind them, freighted with flour, salt pork, and whiskey. Hers was the most precious. Under a canvas tarp lay crates of quinine, carbolic acid, bandages, and laudanum, a cargo of healing for a town that knew only how to tear open the earth. The heat shimmered over the ocotillo and sagebrush, playing tricks on the eye. A distant butte seemed to float above the horizon, and the sky was a pale, merciless blue. There was a stillness to the land that was not peaceful. It was the stillness of a held breath, of a predator waiting. Eliza felt it in the base of her spine, a low thrum of anxiety she had learned to trust. She had been a field nurse, following her father, the doctor, on his calls to remote ranches. She knew the many faces of silence. "Feels quiet today," Billy said, his humming ceasing. "Too quiet." Eliza nodded, her eyes scanning the rock formations to their right, a jumble of sandstone cliffs and boulders that looked like sleeping giants. "Keep the rifle close, Billy, but keep it on your lap. No need to show our teeth before we see a wolf." The words were barely out of her mouth when the silence shattered. A high, ululating cry echoed from the rocks, a sound designed to curdle the blood. It was followed by another, and then the thunder of unshod ponies. They burst from the canyon, a dozen riders painted in garish streaks of ochre and black, feathers flying from their hair. Chaos erupted. The driver of the lead wagon screamed as an arrow sprouted from his shoulder. The mules brayed in terror, threatening to bolt. Billy fumbled with his rifle, his youthful bravado dissolving into stark fear. Eliza's own heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands tightened on the reins, her mind racing. Something was wrong. The cries sounded forced, theatrical. The riders, for all their speed, moved with a certain clumsiness, their bodies not quite one with their mounts. An arrow thudded into the sideboard of her wagon, inches from her arm. She glanced at it. The fletching was made of coarse turkey feathers, dyed a lurid green. The shaft was rough, hastily made. It was not the work of a man who lived by the bow. Men from the other wagons were returning fire, the loud cracks of their rifles echoing in the sudden din. But the attackers were closing in, their faces contorted in what looked more like grimaces of effort than true battle rage. One of them, a heavy-set man with a pasty face beneath the paint, galloped alongside her wagon and made a clumsy leap. He landed half in, half out, his momentum carrying him forward. He grabbed her, his hand tangling in her hair, and pulled her from the bench. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. The red dust rose up to choke her. The man stood over her, a knife in his hand, his breath coming in ragged, whiskey-soured gasps. He was supposed to look fearsome, but all Eliza could see was the fear in his own eyes, the eyes of a bully playing a part he did not fully understand. "The medicine wagon," he grunted, more to himself than to her. "Crowley wants the medicine wagon burned." The name hit her like a physical blow. Silas Crowley. The cattle baron who was squeezing this territory until it bled, the man whose shadow stretched all the way to Santa Fe. Before the man could move, before Eliza could even draw a breath to scream, another figure appeared, He did not ride in with a thunder of hooves. He was simply there, having materialized from the landscape itself. He was tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that made the other attackers look like clumsy plowboys. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his skin the color of the earth, his long black hair held back by a thin leather band. There was no paint on his face, only an expression of cold, focused intensity. This was an Apache, but he was not with them. He moved with an impossible speed. The man standing over Eliza had no time to react. The Apache warrior sidestepped the wild swing of the knife, his hand darting out to seize the man's wrist. There was a sharp crack of bone, and the knife clattered to the ground. The attacker screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. With a single, efficient motion, the Apache warrior struck the man at the base of his skull with the heel of his hand. The man crumpled, a boneless heap in the dust. The battle, which had been a chaotic flurry of noise and motion, seemed to freeze. The other attackers saw him, and a new kind of fear, a genuine one, entered their eyes. This was not part of the plan. They were play-acting, and a real wolf had just walked onto their stage. The Apache warrior ignored them. His dark eyes, intelligent and piercing, met Eliza's. He knelt beside the fallen man and picked up the cheap arrow that had struck her wagon. He held it up for her to see, his lip curling in a gesture of profound contempt. He snapped the shaft over his knee with a sharp crack, letting the two pieces fall into the dust. He then pointed a finger at the turkey feather fletching on another arrow lying nearby. His meaning was clear. A silent lecture in the midst of mayhem. This is false. The remaining attackers needed no further encouragement. They wheeled their ponies around, their faint war cries forgotten, and galloped back toward the rocks, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The silence that descended was heavier than before, thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. The Apache warrior stood. He looked at Eliza, his gaze lingering for a moment, not with threat, but with a deep, searching quality, as if he were trying to read the lines of her character in the space of a single breath. He was the chief, Nantan Kai, though she did not know his name then. He saw not just a frightened woman, but a steady one whose eyes, even in the dirt, held a spark of understanding. He bent down one last time. With the tip of his knife, he drew a quick, deliberate symbol in the red dust beside her. It was a straight line, representing a path or a truth. He then drew a second, wavering line that crossed it, and with a final flick of the blade, he severed the wavering line where it met the straight one. A lie, cut down by the truth. Without another glance, he turned and walked toward the rocks. He did not run. He simply walked, and in moments, the shimmering heat and the ancient stones seemed to swallow him. He was gone. Billy and the other survivors rushed to her side. "Mrs. Hart, are you all right?" "Did he hurt you?" Billy asked, his voice trembling. "I am fine," Eliza said, her voice raspy with dust. She pushed herself to a sitting position, her eyes fixed on the symbol on the ground. "We gotta get out of here." Another man, a grizzled teamster named Hank, said, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. "Damned Apaches. They'll be back for sure." They were not Apache, Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. Hank spat a brown stream of tobacco juice. "What are you talking about, woman? We all saw them. The paint, the feathers." "The feathers were wrong," Eliza insisted. Getting to her feet and brushing the dust from her dress, they were turkey feathers, and their arrows were poorly made. "Look," she pointed to the broken pieces Kai had left. "That is not the work of a warrior. It is the work of a man in a hurry, a man making a costume." She looked at the unconscious man on the ground, the cheap paint already starting to run with his sweat. "And that man? He spoke a name. He said Crowley wanted the medicine wagon burned." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Hank's face, but it was quickly replaced by a stubborn scowl. The idea was too complicated, too unsettling. A simple story of a savage attack was easier to hold on to. You must have heard wrong in all the commotion. Crowley is a hard man, but he is not a fool. Why would he do this? To blame them, Eliza said, gesturing toward the mountains. To make everyone believe the Apache are a threat, so he can have a reason to do whatever it is he wants to do. But her words were lost on them. They were men who saw the world in simple terms. They had been attacked by men who looked like Indians, so they had been attacked by Indians. They tended to the wounded driver, righted the wagons, and spoke in low, angry tones about revenge. The symbol in the dust was trampled under their nervous boots, but the image was burned into Eliza's mind. The rest of the journey to the outpost was a grim, silent affair. They arrived as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. It was not a town, merely a collection of adobe buildings huddled around a dusty mercantile and a saloon, a temporary stain on the vast landscape. But their arrival sent a shockwave through the small community. Before the wagon wheels had even stopped turning, the story was spreading, growing more monstrous with each telling. The dozen clumsy attackers became a war party of 100. Their shoddy ambush became a massacre. The single wounded driver became a wagon train of the dead. Men poured out of the saloon, their faces flushed with whiskey and righteous fury. They crowded around the wagons, their voices rising in a single, ugly chorus. We need a posse. String them all up. Marshal Dake will know what to do. We will show them what happens when they cross us. Eliza stood by her wagon, her hands clenched into fists. She felt a profound and chilling isolation. She was the only one who had seen the truth, the only one who had been given the sign. But her voice was a whisper against a hurricane of hatred. She looked at the faces in the crowd, twisted with fear and a kind of grim excitement, and she knew this was just the beginning. The fake arrows had flown, and now the real bloodshed was about to begin. The dust of the Santa Fe Trail had settled, but a storm of a different kind was gathering, and she was standing directly in its path. Copper Gap was a town built on greed and grit, clinging to the edge of a raw, sun-blasted canyon. The air, thick with the metallic tang of the nearby copper mine and the sour smell of unwashed men, felt heavy in Eliza's lungs. In the 2 days since her arrival, the town had become a tinderbox, and she, the woman who spoke of staged attacks and false feathers, was the spark everyone wanted to extinguish. The story of the ambush had calcified into a legend of savage brutality, and her quiet contradictions were seen not as a search for truth, but as a kind of madness, or worse, betrayal. On the third morning, they arrived. Silas Crowley rode a fine black gelding, his saddle trimmed in silver. He was a man in his 40s, handsome in a predatory way, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a smile that never reached them. He wore a tailored coat despite the heat, a testament to a man who refused to bend to the will of the elements. Beside him, Marshal Dake was a study in crude power, a thick, barrel-chested man with a face like a slab of raw meat. His authority resided in the heavy Colt pistol strapped to his hip and the cruel set of his jaw. They addressed the town from the porch of the mercantile. Crowley's voice was smooth as polished stone, a mesmerizing flow of words that washed over the anxious crowd. He spoke of progress, of the great iron snake of the railroad that would bring prosperity and civilization to this wild land. He painted a picture of a secure future, a town safe for their wives and children. But that future, he purred, was threatened. It was threatened by the shadow in the hills, by a savage element that resisted the inevitable tide of history. He offered the town his protection. He would fund a company of vigilantes, good, upstanding citizens, to guard the survey teams and pacify the territory. All he asked for in return was the town's support for the railroad's right-of-way, a simple path through a barren valley. The valley, Eliza knew. That belonged to the Apache. Then Dake spoke, his voice a gravelly roar that seemed to shake the very dust. He needed no honeyed words. He held up a hastily drawn poster promising $500 for the capture of the Apache war chief responsible for the recent violence. The name, he bellowed, was Kai. He would lead the hunt himself, for the good of the people, to ensure justice was swift and final. The crowd roared its approval. They were a single beast with a single mind, hungry for a simple enemy and a simple solution. Eliza slipped away from the edge of the crowd, a cold sickness in her stomach. She saw the lie for what it was, a perfectly constructed cage, and the whole town was clamoring to be locked inside it. She found refuge in a small adobe building with a neatly painted sign that read, Mercy Quinn, midwife and healer. Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs and soap. A woman with a face as wrinkled and kind as a winter apple and hands stained with gentian violet looked up from grinding herbs in a mortar. The woman said, "You are the nurse from the wagon train, the one with the clear eyes." Eliza nodded, feeling a measure of her composure return in the calm atmosphere of the room. "I am Eliza Hart." The woman introduced herself as Mercy Quinn. She said, "I heard what you said about the attack. It takes a strong back to stand against a wind like this. Most folks would rather be wrong with the crowd than right by themselves." Mercy's clinic was a haven of quiet competence. In the corner, on a simple cot, lay a young Apache boy, his leg bound in a splint. His mother sat on the floor beside him, her face a stoic mask, but her hands never stopped smoothing the rough blanket over her son. Mercy followed Eliza's gaze. She explained that the boy had fallen from a ledge. His people were afraid to bring him to the fort's doctor, and for good reason. Just then, the door swung open, and Marshal Dake filled the frame, his shadow falling across the room. His eyes landed on the boy and his mother. He addressed Mercy, his voice dripping with menace. "What is this harboring them now?" Mercy did not flinch. She replied calmly that she was harboring a child with a broken leg. She said, "Sickness and injury do not pick sides, Marshal, and neither do I." Dake took a step into the room, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He sneered, saying that after what they did on the trail, they were lucky his men did not drag them out and hang them from the nearest cottonwood. Mercy's voice was low, but sharp as flint. "Then they would be hanging a child who cannot walk, and you would be a bigger fool than you already are. Now, get out of my clinic unless you are bleeding." For a long moment, Dake stared at her, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. Then, with a curse, he turned and stomped out. Mercy let out a slow breath. She looked at Eliza and said, "The pay is not much, but the work is honest. I could use another pair of hands. Another soul who knows the difference between a patient and a political statement." That night, in the small room Eliza had taken at Mabel's boarding house, she could not sleep. The angry shouts from the saloon carried on the night air, a constant reminder of the fury Dake and Crowley had unleashed. As she stared out the small window at the moonlit dust of the street, she saw something glinting on the packed earth just below. Her heart quickened. She pulled on her boots, draped a shawl over her shoulders, and slipped out the back of the house. In the cool darkness, she found them. A small collection of smooth, pale river stones, arranged in a deliberate pattern. It was an arrow, but its shaft was wavy, like a serpent, an arrow of water. It pointed away from the town, toward the dark ribbon of the creek that fed the canyon. It was a message, a summons. Fear and caution warred within her. This could be a trap. But the memory of the warrior's intelligent eyes, the contempt with which he had snapped the false arrow, persuaded her. He had not saved her life only to end it in the dark. She followed the direction of the stones, her steps silent on the soft earth, moving through the shadows until she reached the low, gurgling sound of the creek. He was waiting in the deep shade of a mesquite tree, a figure of stillness against the whispering water. Kai. He did not startle as she approached, as if he had been listening to her footsteps from the moment she left the house. He spoke, his voice a low murmur that blended with the night sounds, the woman who sees with her own eyes. Eliza stopped a few feet from him, her hand clutching her shawl. She replied, "The man who speaks with a knife in the dust." He acknowledged her words with a slight nod. He told her, Crowley's men will ride in 2 days. They will not be wearing paint this time. They will wear the badges Crowley gives them. They will come to my people's winter grounds, to the valley he wants for his iron road." She asked him how he knew this. He said, "I was a scout once. For the army, I learned to read the signs they leave, but I also learned to read their hearts. They are loud with their greed." He told her he was moving the elders, the women, and the children into the high canyons, to a place they called Thunder Gorge, a place that was easier to defend. It was her turn. She told him what she had seen and heard in town, the lies, the manufactured rage, the way Crowley and Dake played the people like a fiddle. She spoke of the railroad and the promise of protection given in exchange for the land. As she spoke, a low rumble echoed from the distant mountains. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of rain on dry earth. A sudden wind whipped down the creek bed, carrying with it the first fat drops of rain. Kai looked up at the sky. A flash flood. "The creek will rise?" He said it not with alarm, but with a simple acceptance of the land's power. He told her to go back before the storm broke and her path was cut off. He said, "Tell the healer, Mercy, to be ready. There will be more injuries than a boy's broken leg. Do not trust the lawman. Trust your own eyes." He melted back into the shadows, and Eliza hurried back toward the sleeping town as the rain began to fall in earnest. By the time she reached her room, the creek was a churning, muddy torrent. The next afternoon, the stage brought the mail and a rider named Miguel Ortega. He was a wiry man of Mexican descent, his face a roadmap of sun and wind. He delivered a packet of letters to the mercantile, but he sought Eliza out afterward, finding her helping Mercy change the Apache boy's dressing. He spoke in a low, urgent voice. He had seen a camp a day's ride east, surveyors, and with them were a dozen armed guards. He had heard them talking. They were not waiting for Dake's posse. They were planning to start running their lines through the valley the next day. Orders from Crowley himself. The timeline had moved up. The trap was about to be sprung. Eliza felt a familiar knot of despair. They had a warning, but no proof. Nothing but her word against the town's hysteria. That evening, as she was leaving the clinic, a man stepped out of the alley beside her. He was young, with a thoughtful, worried face. His hands clean and his clothes those of a man who worked with his head, not his back. He asked quietly if she was Eliza Hart. He introduced himself as Jonas Reed. He was the lead engineer for the railroad survey team. He looked around nervously before continuing. He said, "What they are doing is wrong. This is not about a right-of-way. It is about a land grab." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was a topographical map. He unfolded it, and in the fading light, he pointed to a section of the valley. He explained, "The best route for the railroad is here. To the north, it is flatter, more direct. But this," he traced a second, less logical path. "This is the route Mr. Crowley insists upon." He then pointed to a series of markings in the hills adjacent to Crowley's preferred route. He said, "Those are his copper claims. Undeclared. The railroad will not bring prosperity to the town. Not really. It will bring it to him. It will allow him to haul his ore to the smelters for next to nothing." He folded the map and pushed it into her hands. He said he could not speak out. He had a family back east, but he could not be a party to this either. He said, "Courage is not just about shouting. Sometimes it is about making sure the right person has the truth in their hands." He tipped his hat and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Eliza standing alone in the dusty street. She held the map, the paper warm in her hand. It was more than lines and figures. It was evidence. It was a weapon. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would have to use it. The quiet life she had once imagined for herself was gone, washed away like the path by the creek. She was part of this now, bound to a silent Apache chief by a shared truth, and standing against a tide of hatred with nothing but her own conviction and a piece of paper that could save lives or get her killed. The dry wind that blew down from the mountains carried the scent of smoke long before the glow appeared on the horizon. It was a bitter, unnatural smell that scraped the back of the throat, different from the clean scent of a pinon campfire. Eliza stood outside Mercy's clinic, watching the angry orange pulse against the dark canvas of the night sky. The town was buzzing. Marshal Dake's newly deputized vigilantes had ridden out at sunset, their faces grim and self-important, their rifles held high. They were going to teach the Apache a lesson, to deliver justice for the wagon train. The men in the saloon cheered them on, buying them rounds of whiskey for their courage. Eliza, holding the engineer's map in her pocket, felt a familiar, helpless anger. They were riding to deliver a lie. Mercy came to stand beside her, wrapping a wool shawl around her shoulders. She said, "There is no sleep to be had on a night like this. The air itself feels sick." Eliza gestured with her chin toward the fiery glow. "That is Kai's people's wintering ground. The valley Crowley wants. But Kai told me he was moving the women and children. The camp should be empty." Mercy's gaze was sharp. An empty camp makes for a poor massacre, but a fire makes for a good story. She went back inside and returned a moment later with a large leather satchel. She pressed it into Eliza's hands. It was filled with salves, bandages, and a bottle of carbolic water. Mercy said, "Fires are unpredictable. Even an empty camp can hold a life. Someone old, or slow, or stubborn. If you feel you must go, do not go empty-handed." The unspoken permission, the trust in Mercy's eyes, was all Eliza needed. She saddled the quiet mare she had purchased from the livery, her movements swift and practiced. She did not ride directly toward the fire, but followed the creek bed, keeping to the shadows. The map in her pocket a constant, crinkling reminder of the larger game being played. As she drew closer, the smell of smoke became suffocating. Ash, fine and gray as ghosts, drifted down, coating the leaves of the mesquite and settling on her hair. She dismounted a quarter-mile from the camp and approached on foot, her boots silent on the sandy soil. The vigilantes were already leaving. She heard their loud, boasting voices, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the suddenly quiet canyon. They had done their work. The camp was a scene of senseless destruction. The hide coverings of the wickiups had been torn away and set ablaze. The skeletal frames of willow branches glowed like demonic rib cages against the night. The fire had been set with a crude, vindictive haste, designed not for warmth or cooking, but purely for annihilation. It was a stage, just as the ambush had been, set for an audience back in Copper Gap. Then she heard it, a low, rasping cough, followed by a weak cry in a language she did not understand. It came from the largest of the burning structures, one that had partially collapsed in on itself. A thick, smoldering support beam lay across the entrance. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. Mercy had been right. She ran forward, the medical satchel bumping against her hip, peering through the smoke. She could just make out a figure huddled in the far corner. An old woman, her face a mask of terror and pain, her long gray hair unbound and wild. Just as Eliza reached the entrance, a shadow detached itself from the rocks above the camp. Kai landed on the ground as silently as an owl, his face a mask of cold fury as he took in the devastation. His eyes found Eliza, and for a second, a flicker of suspicion crossed his features. Then he saw the satchel, the determined set of her jaw, and he understood. He pointed to the smoldering beam. He said, "I will move it. You will get her." His voice was tight, clipped. There was no time for questions. He put his shoulder to the heavy wood, his muscles straining. Smoke billowed around him, and the heat was intense. With a great heave, he shifted the beam just enough for Eliza to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick and searing. The old woman had her arm thrown over her face, trying to shield herself from the embers. Eliza spoke in a low, soothing voice, the way she would to a frightened horse. "It is all right. I am here to help you. I am a healer." The woman flinched away from her, her dark eyes wide with fear. Eliza held up her empty hands, showing she meant no harm. She knelt and gently touched the woman's shoulder. The woman's breathing was shallow and rapid. Eliza could see a nasty burn on her forearm and knew the smoke had done damage to her lungs. "Come, we must go," Eliza urged, trying to help her up. Outside, Kai had braced the beam. He called out, his voice sharp with urgency. "The roof is giving way," with Eliza supporting most of her weight. The old woman managed to stumble through the opening just as the rest of the structure groaned and collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. Kai let the beam fall and rushed to them, taking the old woman's other side. Together, they half carried, half dragged her away from the burning camp and into the safety of the rocks. They laid her down on a patch of cool sand. Eliza immediately went to work. She cleaned the burn with the carbolic water, her fingers gentle but efficient. The woman winced but did not cry out. Eliza then applied a soothing salve and wrapped the arm in clean linen. She listened to the woman's chest, the rasping sound confirming her fears about smoke inhalation. Kai watched her, his expression unreadable. He had a small water skin, and he gave the old woman a few sips. A handful of other Apache warriors had appeared on the ridge lines, silent witnesses to the scene below. They had seen the fire, seen their chief and this white woman rescue one of their elders. When Eliza was finished, Kai spoke to the old woman in their tongue. Her reply was weak, but her eyes, when they looked at Eliza, no longer held fear. They held a dawning gratitude. Kai turned to Eliza. He said, "Her name is Tista. She stayed behind to gather the sacred pollen. She did not believe they would burn an empty camp." Eliza replied, "They did not care if it was empty. They only needed the flames." He nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He told her, "You have earned a great honor tonight. My people will not forget this. She will be cared for." He looked at her, his gaze direct and searching. He said, "You have proven your heart is not the same color as your skin." With a signal from Kai, two of the warriors came down and gently lifted Tista, carrying her away into the darkness. Kai lingered for a moment. He told her, "Dake will need more than a fire. He will need a body. Be careful." He disappeared as he always did, leaving Eliza alone with the dying flames and the lingering stink of hatred. The next day, the vigilantes were celebrated as heroes. The story they told was of a fierce battle against a superior force, of their bravery in driving the savages from their den. Marshal Dake used the manufactured victory to tighten his grip on the town. He declared a state of emergency, giving himself the power to arrest anyone he deemed a threat to public safety. His sweeps were random and brutal, targeting anyone who was not white or who had ever spoken a word against Silas Crowley. That afternoon, they arrested Hosa. He was Kai's younger brother by adoption, a fiery, handsome youth of 19. He had come into town to trade for flour, an act of defiance that cost him his freedom. Dake and 3 of his deputies cornered him in the street, claiming he was a spy. Hosa fought back, his pride and anger getting the better of him, which was all the excuse they needed. They beat him into submission and dragged him to the jail. The news reached Eliza through Miguel Ortega, the mail rider, his face grim. He told her they were saying Hosa was the one who led the attack on the wagon train. It was a lie, but a lie the town was eager to believe. Eliza went to the jail, a small, squalid adobe building with barred windows. Dake was standing outside, chewing on a matchstick. He blocked her path. She said, "Marshal, I heard the prisoner is injured. He requires medical attention." Dake laughed, a short, ugly sound. He said, "He requires a rope. That is all the attention he is getting from this town." Eliza stood her ground. Under territorial law, even a prisoner has a right to be treated by a healer. To deny it is a crime. She was bluffing. She had no idea if such a law existed, but she said it with the authority of her father. The doctor... Dake hesitated. He did not want a dead Apache on his hands before the circuit judge arrived. A public hanging was one thing. A quiet death in a cell was another. It was messy. With a grumble, he let her pass. He told her she had 5 minutes. The cell was dark and smelled of sweat and despair. Hosa was slumped on the floor in the corner. One eye was swollen shut, and his lip was split. But it was his hands that made Eliza's breath catch. They were bound tightly in front of him, and the rope had been pulled so cruelly that his wrists were raw and bleeding. And on his right wrist, there was something else, a dark, ugly mark, a perfect circle seared into the skin. She knelt beside him, opening her satchel. He flinched as she reached for him, his one good eye filled with hate. She spoke softly. "I am a friend of your brother. I helped Tista." His expression softened slightly at the mention of the old woman's name. He allowed her to clean his cuts. When she examined his wrist, her touch was feather-light. It was a brand, made by the heated barrel of a pistol, a mark of ownership, a mark of contempt. It was a wound meant not just to cause pain, but to humiliate. She treated the wound, her mind working furiously. This was not a simple beating. This was methodical. This was evidence. She made a detailed mental inventory of every bruise, every laceration, and especially the brand. She knew she would have to write it down, to document it with the precision of a medical record. As she was finishing, Hosa whispered to her, his voice hoarse, "Tell my brother they are moving me, at dawn, to the army fort, Fort Defiance." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Fort Defiance was 100 miles away. Once he was there, he would be lost to them, swallowed by a system that had no ears for the truth. Dake appeared at the door. "Time is up." Eliza packed her bag, her face a neutral mask. She gave Hosa a final, steady look, a silent promise. As she walked out into the harsh sunlight, she knew everything had changed. The fight was no longer just about land or a railroad. It had become a race against time, a desperate struggle for a young man's life. And Kai, she knew, would not sit back and let his brother be taken. His anger would be a fire, and she feared that this time not even his strategic mind could contain the blaze. The knowledge that Hosa would be moved at dawn was a ticking clock in Eliza's mind, each second a grain of sand slipping away. There would be no rescue attempt on the road to Fort Defiance. Kai was a strategist, not a fool, and he would not sacrifice his warriors in a suicidal assault against army regulars. The only path left was to cut the head off the snake before its venom could spread further. That meant destroying Silas Crowley, and for that, she needed more than the word of a frightened engineer. She needed proof, on paper, in Crowley's own hand. She found Jonas Reed near the surveyor's tents, packing his instruments with a grim finality. He had been ordered to proceed with the survey through the valley in the morning, with or without Dake's posse. When she told him what she needed, his face went pale in the twilight. He shook his head, saying it was impossible. Crowley's office at Station 17 was a fortress. He kept guards. Eliza's voice was low and steady. "You said courage was about putting the truth in the right hands. My hands are empty. Jonas, and a boy's life is running out. We have until dawn." The engineer's internal struggle was plain on his face. He looked at his hands, then at the vast, darkening desert. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. He explained that a supply train was due to arrive from Santa Fe after midnight. The guards would be busy at the loading dock. Crowley would be in town, cementing his power at the saloon. It was the only window they would have. He drew a quick map in the dust, showing her the small office at the back of the main depot. "A single window," he said. "The lock is old." Hours later, under a sky littered with cold, distant stars, Eliza rode her mare to a prearranged spot a mile from Station 17. Jonas was waiting, his horse skittish in the darkness. He led her on a wide, circuitous route to the back of the depot, a long, low building that hulked in the moonlight. The sounds of men shouting and the rumble of a heavy freight wagon came from the front, just as he had predicted. The window was small and coated with a thick layer of grime. Jonas worked with a thin piece of metal, his engineer's hands surprisingly deft. After a tense minute that stretched into an eternity, the lock gave with a faint click. He helped her climb through. into the suffocating darkness of the office. She whispered her thanks, and he replied, "Just be quick, he would keep watch." Eliza struck a match, the sudden flare of light revealing a room that was the very image of Silas Crowley. A heavy oak desk stood in the center, its surface neat and orderly. A large map of the territory was pinned to one wall, the proposed railroad line drawn in a bold, arrogant slash of red ink directly through the Apache Valley. The air smelled of cigar smoke, leather, and money. She lit a small oil lamp, keeping the flame low, and went to the desk. The drawers were locked. She looked around the room, her eyes falling on a framed photograph of a severe-looking man, likely Crowley's father. Acting on a hunch, she lifted it. A small iron key was taped to the back. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the main drawer. It was filled with ledgers and contracts. She scanned them quickly, her nurse's training in reading doctor's scrawls helping her decipher the hurried handwriting. She found shipping manifests, land deeds, but nothing that explicitly connected him to the violence. Then, in a slim portfolio at the bottom, she found them, letters, a half-dozen of them, written on expensive paper from back east. They were from a railroad syndicate, a powerful consortium of investors. The language was veiled, but the meaning was brutally clear. Phrases leaped out at her: the necessity of clearing the territory of hostiles, the assurance that local authorities had been properly incentivized, a direct reference to a bonus payment upon the successful acquisition of the valley right-of-way, unencumbered by native claims. It was all there. A conspiracy spelled out in elegant, looping script. She gathered the letters, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had it, the truth, on paper. As she turned to leave, her elbow brushed the lamp. It tilted, sputtered, and went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. At the same instant, she heard the crunch of a boot on the gravel just outside the office door. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She froze, listening to the sound of a key scraping in the lock. There was no time to get to the window. Her eyes darted around the dark room, finding a single point of deeper blackness, a narrow space between a tall filing cabinet and the wall. She squeezed into it, pressing herself flat, making herself small, praying the shadows would be enough. The door opened. A lantern swung into the room, held by one of Dake's deputies. He grunted in frustration at the darkness, then placed his lantern on the desk and fumbled with the main office lamp. Turning up the wick. Light flooded the room. Eliza held her breath, convinced the frantic beating of her heart was loud enough for him to hear. The deputy was not looking for an intruder. He was looking for a bottle. He opened another drawer, pulled out a flask of whiskey, and took a long drink. He was about to leave when his eyes fell on the desk. The photograph was slightly askew. The key was still in the lock of the open drawer. His posture changed instantly. He drew his pistol, his eyes scanning the room. "Who is in here?" he snarled. Eliza knew she had only a second. As he took a step toward her hiding place, she bolted. She shoved past him, knocking him off balance, and scrambled out the door into the night. He bellowed in surprise and rage, and a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the door frame beside her head. There was no time to find Jonas or her horse. She ran with the letters clutched in her hand, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and that station. She fled into the open desert, a desperate, solitary figure under the vast, indifferent sky. Shouts erupted behind her. Men were gathering. They would have horses. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. She could hear the drumming of hooves now. They were fanning out, their lanterns swinging like malevolent fireflies in the darkness. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the horizon. They had seen her. Just as despair began to set in, the wind began to rise. It started as a low moan, then grew to a sharp, whistling shriek. The sand began to shift and dance around her feet. The stars disappeared, blotted out by a rising wall of darkness, a sandstorm. Within minutes, the world was gone, replaced by a roaring, suffocating chaos of red dust. The wind tore at her clothes and stung her eyes. She could not see, could not breathe. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and curled into a ball, pulling her shawl over her head to create a small pocket of air. The letters were tucked safely inside her dress. She had the proof, but she was going to die with it, buried alive in the heart of the desert. Then, through the roar of the wind, a hand touched her shoulder, firm and steady. She cried out, lashing out in terror, thinking her pursuers had found her. But a voice cut through the storm, low and calm, right beside her ear. "It is I." "Kai." He was a phantom in the swirling red haze. He pulled her to her feet and pressed the edge of his waterskin to her lips. He had wrapped a piece of cloth over his own nose and mouth. He gestured for her to follow, his hand never leaving her arm, a solid anchor in the maelstrom. She could not imagine how he had found her, how he navigated in this blinding chaos. He moved with an unnerving confidence, reading the land through some sense she could not comprehend. He led her for what felt like miles, though it was likely only a few hundred yards, until they came to a large outcropping of rock. He guided her into a deep fissure, a natural shelter protected from the main force of the wind. The roar softened to a mournful howl. They collapsed onto the sandy floor of the small cave, the silence within the shelter profound after the fury outside. Eliza was shaking, from exhaustion and cold and the lingering terror. Kai sat a few feet away, a still, patient presence in the gloom. "After a long time," he spoke, his voice quiet. He asked her, "Why do you do this? Why do you risk your life for my brother, for my people?" Eliza thought for a moment, the question settling deep inside her. "Because my husband is dead," she said, the words coming out rough and raw. "And my father is dead. They were good men who believed the world could be better than it is. And I am tired of seeing the world they believed in trampled into the dust by men like Crowley." She clutched the letters through the fabric of her dress. "I do this because the truth matters." Kai was silent for a long time, watching her. The dim light from the storm-ravaged world outside cast his face in shadow, accentuating the hard lines of his jaw and the deep sadness in his eyes. He finally said, "The truth is a sharp stone. The white men do not like to hold it. They prefer a soft lie." He told her about his time as a scout. He spoke of a battle, a supposed victory, where the soldiers had attacked a peaceful camp, not unlike his own. He spoke of the promises made and the treaties broken. He did not describe the violence in detail, but Eliza, with her nurse's understanding of wounds, could feel the scars on his soul. He spoke of watching men he had respected, men he had thought honorable, commit acts of unspeakable cruelty in the name of progress. He said, "I learned then that their law is a rope. It is flexible enough to hang any man whose skin is the wrong color. That is why I left. I will not help them tie the noose for my own people." His confession hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built of shared pain and disillusionment. He was not just a fierce warrior. He was a man who had seen the very worst of her world and had chosen to walk away from it. Eliza felt her own fears, her own sense of isolation, begin to recede. She was not alone in her fight. She took the shawl from her head, the one she had used to shield her face from the dust, and tore a strip from it. She dipped it in the last of her water from a small canteen and reached across the space between them. She gently wiped the grit from a shallow cut on his cheek he had gotten in the storm. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it was more intimate than any touch they had shared. He did not pull away. She wore a cotton shawl, now stained with the red dust of the storm, the same color as the earth, the same color as his skin. It was their common ground. They did not speak again for the rest of the night. They sat in the shelter of the rock, two solitary figures listening to the wind scour the world clean. As the first pale light of dawn filtered into the cave, the storm began to subside. When they finally emerged, the world was transformed. The landscape was a series of smooth, rolling dunes. The air was crisp and clear, but every track, every sign of their desperate flight and the pursuit had been completely erased, buried under a fresh blanket of sand. The truth was safe in her hand, but the desert had swallowed all proof of how she had come by it. The journey from the rock shelter was a walking dream, a blur of pale morning light on an ocean of sand. The world had been wiped clean, and Eliza felt as if she had been wiped clean with it, hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. Every step was an effort of will. The letters she had stolen were a hard, sharp lump against her ribs, a physical reminder of the reality that lay beyond the beautiful, sterile landscape. Kai walked beside her, a constant, silent presence. He had given her the last of his water, and when she stumbled, his hand was there to steady her arm, his grip strong but impersonal. He led her not toward the familiar canyons near Copper Gap, but higher into the foothills, following hidden paths that only he could see. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, they came to a small, secluded mesa, tucked against the cliff face, almost invisible from a distance, was a dwelling. It was not a temporary wickiup, but a more permanent structure. A small house built of sturdy piñon logs and adobe, with a flat roof that blended into the red rock behind it. It was a home built for solitude and survival, a place of quiet strength, much like the man himself. The moment they stepped into the cool, shaded interior, the last of Eliza's strength deserted her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the chase and the storm vanished, and a violent tremor seized her body. A deep, racking chill set in, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. The dust she had inhaled now felt like a fire in her lungs. She swayed on her feet, the room dissolving into a dark, swirling vortex. Kai caught her before she fell. He lifted her as easily as if she were a child and carried her to a raised sleeping platform covered with soft, well-worn furs. He laid her down gently and covered her with a heavy wool blanket. She curled into a tight ball, shivering, only vaguely aware of his movements as he stoked the embers in a small fire pit in the center of the room. The day passed in a feverish haze. She was aware of moments of clarity, like islands in a fog. She felt a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. The scent of brewing herbs, bitter and medicinal, filled the air. Kai's hands, surprisingly gentle, supported her head as he held a cup of warm, potent tea to her lips, urging her to drink. He did not speak much, but his presence was a constant, watchful comfort. At one point, when a harsh, dry cough seized her, he knelt beside her and placed a hand on her back, listening to the strained sound of her breathing with an unnerving focus, his brow furrowed with a healer's concern. Sometime late in the afternoon, the fever peaked. She tossed in the furs, lost in a landscape of nightmares. She was running through the endless sand again, the shouts of Dake's men just behind her. She was trapped in the burning wickiup with Tista, the smoke choking her. Through it all, a sense of profound loneliness washed over her, the weight of her solitary fight pressing down until she felt she could not breathe. She must have cried out when her eyes fluttered open. Kai was there, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. He was sitting on the edge of the platform, a small bowl of water beside him. He had been bathing her face again. Her violent shivering had subsided, leaving her weak and drenched in sweat. Her hair was a tangled mess, caked with the red dust of the storm. He looked at it, then rose and went to a small wooden chest in the corner. He returned with a comb, carved from a single piece of dark wood, its handle worn smooth with time and use. Intricate patterns, symbols of wind and water, were etched into its surface. It was an object of beauty and history, something passed down through generations. He sat behind her and gently lifted her head onto his lap. Eliza was too weak to protest, too exhausted to feel anything but a sense of surrender. He began to work through the tangles in her hair, starting from the ends and moving slowly upward, his movements patient and methodical. Each stroke of the wooden comb was unbelievably gentle, a slow, rhythmic untangling of the chaos of the past day. It was an act of profound and unexpected intimacy, a quiet grooming that spoke of care, not passion. The steady, repetitive motion was deeply soothing, and Eliza felt the last of the tension drain from her body. Her mind was drifting, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, aware only of the warmth of the fire, the soft furs beneath her, and the gentle tug of the comb through her hair. Through this peaceful haze, she heard his voice, a low murmur, softer than the whisper of the wind outside. It was not meant to command, but to reassure, a simple statement of protection offered to a weary soul. "You sleep in my bed tonight," the Apache chief murmured, brushing her hair. "Loves her forever." The last words were a silent breath, a truth he acknowledged only to himself and to the spirits in the quiet room. A feeling that had taken root in the desert and was now, in this moment of quiet care, undeniable. Eliza, lost in her exhaustion, heard only the promise of safety. She gave a small sigh and finally, truly, fell asleep. When she woke again, it was dark outside, and the fever had broken. She felt weak, but her mind was clear. Kai was sitting by the fire, sharpening the blade of his knife with a whetstone. The small, scraping sound was the only noise in the room. He looked up as she stirred, his expression calm. He rose and brought her a bowl of thin broth. It was savory and warm, and she drank it gratefully. She said, her voice a hoarse whisper, "Thank you, you saved my life." Again. He simply nodded and returned to his seat by the fire. A comfortable silence settled between them. It was in this quiet space that Eliza felt a sudden need to offer something of herself, to bridge the gap between them with something other than shared danger. She pushed back the blanket and sat up, her movement slow. She pointed to a thin, silvery scar on her collarbone, barely visible in the firelight. "I was 6 years old. I tried to climb a tree to rescue a kitten, and a branch broke." Kai stopped his work, listening. She continued, "My father, the doctor, was away. My mother found me. I was bleeding and screaming. She did not panic. She just held me, told me I was brave. And then she cleaned the wound and stitched it herself. She told me later that a scar was not a sign of damage, but a sign that you had healed. She was the one who taught me that the first duty of a human being is to soothe the pain of another, no matter who they are." She looked at him, her gaze direct. "That is why I do this, not for politics or land, but because men like Crowley and Dake create pain, and I know how to heal it." He looked at the scar, then back at her face. He saw not just a nurse, not just an ally, but a woman with her own history, her own code of honor, forged in a childhood of love and lessons. He finally said, "Your mother was a wise woman. My people believe the same. A healer walks on sacred ground." He set his knife and stone aside. "We must have rules," he said, changing the subject, "but not the tone of respect. To save my brother and to stop this poison before it spreads. We must act as one, but I will not command you, and you will not command me. We will be partners. We will share what we know, and we will respect the other's ways." Eliza nodded. "Respect and no coercion. We do this because we choose to, not because we are forced. We will use these letters." She touched her dress where they were hidden. "And your knowledge of the land. We will expose him, not just for Hosa, but for everyone." It was an oath, sworn in the quiet of his home, witnessed only by the dancing flames. They both knew the danger they were in, not just from Crowley, but from the world itself, a white woman and an Apache chief, working together. If discovered, their alliance would be condemned by both sides, twisted into something ugly and sordid. They were acknowledging their fear of this, and their fear of the deeper connection growing between them, a connection that had no place in this violent, divided world. But in that moment, in the warmth of the small house, those fears seemed very far away. What was real was the quiet understanding that had passed between them. The intimacy they had shared had nothing to do with passion and everything to do with care. It was the simple, profound act of one human being offering shelter to another. And as Eliza lay back down in the warm furs, she understood that a home was not a building, but a place where you were safe enough to heal. The plan was born of quiet desperation in the safety of Kai's home. It was a desperate gamble, relying on the fickle conscience of a town steeped in fear. Market day in Copper Gap was the one time the entire territory seemed to gather in the town's dusty plaza. Miners, ranchers, prospectors, and their families crowded between the stalls, creating a chaotic, swirling mass of humanity. It was their only stage, their only jury. 2 days later, Eliza was part of that crowd, the letters from the railroad syndicate tucked securely in an inside pocket of her dress. She moved with a purpose that set her apart from the casual shoppers, her eyes fixed on the makeshift auction block that had been set up in front of the mercantile. Silas Crowley stood there, looking every bit the benevolent patriarch, his voice smooth and reassuring as he spoke to the assembled townsfolk. He was not selling household goods or cattle. He was selling horses, a fine herd of tough, desert-bred ponies with familiar markings that made Eliza's stomach clench. They were the Apache's horses, seized in the name of public safety. It was theft, sanctified by a cheering crowd. Kai was nowhere to be seen, but she knew he was close. He and 3 of his best warriors were hidden, watching, waiting for the moment. Their agreement had been clear. She would be the voice, he would be the sword, but only if the voice failed. Marshal Dake stood beside Crowley, his hand resting on his pistol, a smug look of ownership on his face. The first horse was brought forward, a beautiful paint mare that fought the rope, her eyes wide with terror. Crowley began the bidding, his words painting a picture of righteous conquest. These are the spoils of victory. My friends, a small measure of justice for the blood that was spilled on the Santa Fe Trail. The crowd roared. A bid was shouted. Then another. Eliza pushed her way forward, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She stepped into the clear space in front of the auction block, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, cutting through the bidding. Stop this auction. These horses are stolen property. A wave of silence washed over the plaza. Every head turned to face her. Crowley's smile tightened, a barely perceptible flicker of annoyance. Dake's face darkened with predictable fury. What is the meaning of this, woman? Dake growled, taking a step forward. Eliza held her ground. She pulled one of the letters from her pocket, holding it high for all to see. This is the meaning. Marshal, this is a letter from the Trans-Western Railroad Syndicate. It proves that the attack on the wagon train was a lie, a pretext to steal this land. It proves Silas Crowley instigated the violence to get his right of way. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Men looked at each other, then at Crowley, then back at Eliza. The simple, satisfying narrative of good versus evil had just been complicated. Crowley laughed, a rich, dismissive sound, the desperate ravings of a hysterical woman. He said, gesturing to Eliza, "We all know what happened. This woman has spent too much time in the sun. Or perhaps she has spent too much time with the very savages who attacked our people." Dake seized on the accusation. "That is right. She has been seen sneaking from town at night. She is an Apache sympathizer, a traitor to her own kind. She is no better than them." The crowd, which had been wavering, began to shift. The murmurs grew hostile. Traitor was a powerful word, an ugly brand. Eliza saw the doubt in their eyes being replaced by suspicion, their fear being channeled back into a familiar, comfortable hatred. Her evidence was just paper. Dake's accusation was a fire. Just as the mood turned definitively against her, Crowley played his final, cruel card. He gave a nod to Dake, who in turn signaled to 2 of his deputies standing by the jail. They emerged a moment later, dragging a prisoner between them. It was Hosa. He was bound and gagged, his face bruised and swollen. They shoved him forward until he stumbled and fell in the dust at the foot of the auction block. The brand on his wrist was a dark, angry circle for all to see. Crowley's voice dripped with false piety. "This is the animal that led the attack. We will deal with him after the auction. Perhaps a public demonstration of Copper Gap justice is in order." The sight of his brother, humiliated and helpless, was too much for Kai to bear. There was a sudden commotion at the edge of the plaza. A horse suddenly bolted, scattering a group of onlookers. In the ensuing confusion, a figure moved with impossible speed. Kai was there. He had not charged in. He had simply appeared, a knife in his hand, moving through the chaos like a phantom. He cut Hosa's bonds with a single slash. At the same moment, his warriors created diversions on the other side of the square. Drawing the attention of Dake's men, the plaza erupted into chaos. People were screaming and running, unsure of what was happening. Dake, his face purple with rage, drew his pistol. He was not aiming at Kai, but at Hosa, who was scrambling to his feet. In that split second, Mercy Quinn, who had been pushing through the crowd to protest the boy's treatment, stepped into the line of fire. The shot cracked through the air. Mercy cried out and staggered back, clutching her arm, a dark stain spreading on her sleeve. The sight of the gentle healer falling galvanized Eliza. The plan was in pieces, the situation spiraling into a bloodbath. She saw Jonas Reed near the small adobe church that bordered the plaza, his face a mask of horror. She ran to him, shouting over the din, "The bell! Jonas, ring the bell!" He understood immediately. They ran to the church, threw open the heavy wooden doors, and grabbed the thick, dusty rope. Together, they pulled. The deep, resonant bong of the church bell cut through the screams and shouts. It was a sound of order, of sanctity, of community. Once, then twice, then a steady, insistent clang that demanded attention. The running stopped. The shouting subsided. The people in the plaza turned as one toward the sound, their mob fury momentarily broken by a lifetime of habit. In that sudden, ringing silence, Kai moved. He launched himself at Dek, not with a weapon, but with his bare hands. The fight was short and brutally efficient. Kai sidestepped the marshal's clumsy lunge, using Dake's own momentum to send him sprawling in the dust. The pistol flew from Dake's hand. Kai was on him in an instant, his knife at the marshal's throat. The entire town watched, breathless. This was the moment of a savage vengeance they had been taught to expect, but it did not come. Kai held the blade steady for a single, tense heartbeat, his eyes locked with Dake's. Then, with a gesture of profound contempt, he pressed the flat of the blade against Dake's cheek, leaving a smear of dust, and stood up. He would not grant this man an honorable death. He would not become the butcher Dake wanted him to be. Humiliated, his authority shattered, Dake scrambled for his fallen pistol. He came up on one knee, his face a twisted mask of pure hatred. The crowd, now a silent assembly of witnesses brought together by the bell, watched him. They saw his desperation, his loss of control. He raised the pistol, his hand shaking with rage. He did not aim at Kai, who was now helping a wounded Hosa to his feet. He aimed at Eliza, who stood on the church steps, her hand still on the bell rope. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains, the sky having darkened unnoticed in the chaos. Just as Dake's finger tightened on the trigger, another shot rang out, this one from the crowd. Dake grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and a red flower bloomed on his shooting arm. He dropped the pistol, his attack thwarted. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the plaza, whipping dust and debris into the air. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, freezing it for a second in a stark, ghostly tableau. The wounded marshal, the defiant Apache chief, the shocked townspeople, and the woman on the church steps, holding the evidence in one hand and the bell rope in the other. Then the heavens opened, and a torrential downpour began, washing the dust from the air and the blood from the ground. The torrential rain did not cleanse Copper Gap. It only turned the dust to a thick, clinging mud that seemed to swallow the light. The chaos in the plaza had shattered the town's fragile unity, leaving behind a residue of fear and confusion. For Silas Crowley, it was a humiliating public defeat. His authority, so carefully constructed on a foundation of lies, had been washed away in a single, chaotic afternoon. Humiliation, however, quickly curdled into a murderous rage. He would not be undone by a woman with a handful of letters and a savage with a sense of theater. While Eliza and Jonas helped a pale but resolute Mercy Quinn back to her clinic, barricading the door against the storm and the town's volatile mood, Crowley was already moving. He gathered his vigilantes in the saloon, his voice a venomous whisper that cut through the roar of the storm outside. He painted a picture of treachery, of a savage uprising abetted by a white traitor. He told them that Kai and his warriors had fled with the boy, Hosa, not in retreat, but to gather their forces for a final, brutal assault on the town, their sanctuary. He snarled. Was a place the old prospectors called Thunder Gorge. They would ride at first light. They would not take prisoners. The escape from the plaza had been a desperate, running fight. Kai with Hosa slung over a pony and his few warriors providing a rear guard, had melted into the storm. They rode hard, the driving rain erasing their tracks, the thunder overhead masking the sound of their hooves. They were heading for the one place they could make a stand, the place where the elders and the children were hidden. Eliza knew she could not stay in town. Mercy's wound was a clean shot through the fleshy part of her arm, painful but not life-threatening. The old healer, her jaw tight with pain, had insisted they leave. She told them, "You have kicked the hornet's nest. Now you must outrun the swarm." She is safe, she assured them. The town still has enough fear of God and her remedies to leave a wounded old woman alone. So, under the cover of the deluge, Eliza and Jonas Reed slipped out of Copper Gap, riding hard for the mountains. The engineer, who had once been a man of paper and calculations, now rode with a rifle across his saddle, his face set with a grim resolve. They reached the entrance to Thunder Gorge as the storm was beginning to break, the sky a canvas of bruised clouds. Kai met them there. The reunion was brief, dictated by the urgency of the moment. Kai's scouts had already reported the movement from town. They had hours. No more. Thunder Gorge was a natural fortress, a deep, narrow canyon carved into the mountainside. Its high, sheer walls offered few points of access, but it was also a trap. If Crowley's men secured the entrance, there was no way out. Kai's preparations were swift and efficient. He was not planning a battle. He was planning a delay. At the narrowest point of the gorge's entrance, his men worked with levers to shift a series of massive boulders into a precarious balance. A single well-placed shot could send 1,000 tons of rock crashing down. Further in, they dug pits and concealed them with brush. While the warriors prepared for the fight, Eliza's role was different. She found the women, the children, and the elders huddled in a large, dry cave complex deep within the gorge. Fear was a palpable thing in the enclosed space, a low hum of anxiety beneath the stoic faces of the women. The children were restless, their dark eyes wide and questioning. Tista, the old woman Eliza had rescued from the fire, was there, her burned arm healing cleanly. She greeted Eliza with a nod of deep respect, a gesture that gave Eliza a standing among the others she could not have earned any other way. Eliza's calm presence was a balm. She moved among them, tending to Hosa's new injuries, checking on the children, and offering quiet words of reassurance. She learned from Tista of another way out of the gorge, a path of last resort. It was a narrow tunnel, an old underground waterway that snaked through the rock and emerged on the far side of the mountain. It would be a difficult, dangerous passage, but it was a chance. The attack came with the afternoon sun, a weak, watery light that did little to dry the sodden earth. Crowley's men rode into the mouth of the gorge with a misplaced confidence, their shouts echoing off the high stone walls. They were met not with a volley of arrows, but with an unnerving silence. The first riders who galloped into the narrow pass disappeared into the pits, their screams of surprise and pain swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. The advance faltered. Crowley, enraged, ordered them forward on foot. As they picked their way through the treacherous terrain, Kai gave a signal. A single rifle shot cracked from the cliffs above, hitting the keystone of the rock trap. With a deafening groan, the rock slide began. Boulders the size of wagons tumbled down the cliff face, shaking the very ground. The vigilantes scrambled back in terror as their path was completely blocked by a mountain of shattered stone. It would take them hours to clear it or find a way around. Kai had bought them precious time. But the vibrations from the rock slide, combined with the rain-soaked earth, had triggered something else. A low, deep rumble began to emanate from the canyon walls high above the caves. It was a sound of immense, terrible power, the sound of the mountain itself beginning to move. Inside the cave, Eliza felt the ground tremble. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. The women clutched their children, their stoicism breaking. Eliza knew they had to move now. She found Kai, his face grim as he watched his men harry Crowley's disorganized forces from the heights. She shouted over the growing rumble, "The mountain is unstable. We have to use the tunnel." Kai looked at the terrified families. Then back at the battle. His duty was split. He gave a sharp nod. "Go, take them. I will hold them here as long as I can." With Tista's guidance, Eliza led the procession of non-combatants into the darkness of the tunnel. The air was cold and damp, the only light coming from a few pine-pitched torches. The passage was narrow and low, forcing them to stoop. The sound of dripping water was a constant accompaniment to the frightened whispers of the children and the distant, terrifying rumble of the shifting earth. Eliza moved up and down the line, her voice a constant, reassuring presence, keeping panic at bay, urging them forward, one step at a time. Outside, the situation grew more desperate. Crowley, driven by a maniacal fury, found a treacherous goat path and led a small group of his best men up the side of the canyon, hoping to outflank Kai's warriors. The fight became a series of brutal, close-quarter skirmishes among the rocks and twisted junipers. The rumbling intensified into a deafening roar. A section of the upper canyon wall, heavy with mud and rock from the storm, gave way. A massive landslide cascaded down, a wave of earth and stone that swept away everything in its path. It was not a weapon of man, but the raw, indiscriminate power of nature unleashed. Kai saw it coming. He shouted a warning to his men, who scrambled for cover. But a small boy, the son of one of his warriors, had been hiding in a shallow alcove directly in the landslide's path. He was frozen with terror, unable to move. Without a second's hesitation, Kai ran toward the boy. He leapt across a chasm, grabbed the child, and threw him to safety just as the wall of mud and rock slammed into the place where he had been standing. Kai himself was caught by the edge of the slide, thrown against a rock face and half buried in the debris. As the dust and mud began to settle, another figure appeared, scrambling down the unstable slope. It was Jonas Reed. He had followed the sound of the fighting. He reached Kai's side and began frantically digging him out with his bare hands. At the same time, Silas Crowley, who had been climbing nearby, saw his chance. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim at the trapped and injured Apache chief. But before he could fire, an old warrior, one who had taught Kai how to track as a boy, threw himself in front of his chief. Crowley's rifle cracked, and the old man fell, his life given to protect the future of his people. The sacrifice gave Kai the moment he needed. With a great roar of rage and grief, he pulled his leg free from the mud and launched himself at Crowley. The two men met in a brutal, desperate clash on the unstable slope. They rolled and clawed at each other, their fight a raw expression of hatred. Kai's knife flashed, opening a long, bloody gash on Crowley's arm. Crowley brought the butt of his rifle down hard, catching Kai on the side of the head, stunning him. For a moment, they stood facing each other, both bleeding. both gasping for breath in the thin mountain air. But Crowley saw his men struggling below. He saw the impassable gorge, and he heard the deep, resonant thunder that seemed to be rolling through the canyon, a sound like the judgment of ancestors. He knew he had lost. This battle, at least. He spat a curse at Kai. This is not over. I will see you hang. He turned and scrambled back down the slope, retreating to gather his forces and plan his next move, a war to be fought not with guns, but with lies and a corrupted law. Jonas helped a limping, bleeding Kai to his feet as they watched him go. The thunder echoed one last time, a mournful, angry cry for the warrior who had fallen. Survival had been secured. For now. But the cost had been terribly high. Silas Crowley returned to Copper Gap not as a defeated man, but as a self-proclaimed champion of order. He did not need to win the fight in the canyon. He only needed to win the story. His retreat was recast as a strategic withdrawal in the face of overwhelming odds. The death of the old Apache warrior was twisted into a heroic sacrifice by one of his own men, a brave vigilante who gave his life defending the town's honor. He and Marshal Dake, his arm now in a sling, set about orchestrating the final act of their play, a public trial. It was not a trial in any formal sense. A traveling magistrate was still weeks away. Instead, they convened a citizens' tribunal in the largest building in town, the saloon. The bar was draped in a flag, and a long poker table was set up for Dake, who appointed himself the presiding officer. The jury was the entire town, a sullen, confused, and deeply divided crowd packed between the tables, their mood as thick and stale as the smell of old whiskey. Hossa was the defendant, charged with insurrection, attempted murder, and a dozen other fabricated crimes. But everyone knew who was truly on trial. It was Eliza Hart, and the Apache chief who remained a phantom in the hills. The proceedings began as a foregone conclusion. Dake called a series of his own men, who swore they had seen Hossa leading the wagon train attack, that they had seen Kai cut down unarmed men in the plaza. Their lies were blatant and rehearsed, but they were delivered with the confidence of men who knew they would not be challenged. Crowley sat in the front row, his injured arm in a fine silk sling, looking like a wounded statesman, his expression a mask of solemn gravity. Then Dake called Eliza to the stand. A low, hostile murmur went through the crowd as she made her way to the front. She stood before the table, not looking at Dake, but at the faces of the townspeople, the miners, the ranchers, the wives, the same people she had hoped to serve with her medicines. Dake leaned forward, his voice a mocking drawl. "So, the Apache nurse, tell us, Mrs. Hart, why should anyone in this room believe a single word you say, when your actions have shown you stand with the savages against your own kind?" Eliza did not answer his question directly. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table. It was a medical report, written in a neat, precise hand. "I am a nurse," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. "It is my duty to report on the condition of my patients. This is the report I wrote after I was permitted to treat the prisoner, Hossa, in your jail." She began to read. She detailed every cut, every bruise. Then she came to the final injury, on the prisoner's right wrist, a third-degree burn, circular in shape, approximately 1/2 inch in diameter. The wound was consistent with the deliberate application of a heated metal object, such as the barrel of a pistol. The clinical, dispassionate description was more damning than any emotional appeal. The word torture was not used, but it hung in the air, thick and ugly. Several men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A brand was not justice. It was the mark of a cattle baron, not a lawman. Next, Jonas Reed was called. He was a credible witness, an educated man from the East with no stake in their local feuds. He unrolled his topographical map on the table for all to see. He explained, with the calm authority of his profession, the logic of railroad engineering. He showed them the optimal route, the one that was cheaper, faster, and safer. Then he showed them the route Crowley had demanded, the one that made no sense. Unless, he said, pointing to the cluster of mineral claims, the railroad's true purpose was not to serve the town, but to serve the private interests of one man. The mood in the room was shifting. Doubt was a seed, and it was beginning to sprout in the fertile ground of the town's long-held resentment of Crowley's wealth and power. Crowley stood up, his voice resonating with indignation. These are lies, slander from a disgruntled employee and a delusional woman. What of her so-called evidence? The letters she claims to have stolen from my office. Let us see them. Eliza produced the letters. Dake snatched them up and handed them to Crowley. He held them up, a look of triumphant scorn on his face. He said, "I have seen these forgeries. A clever attempt, I will admit, but this is not my signature." He pulled a signed land deed from his pocket and passed it among a few of the more prominent citizens. Compare them, you will see. He was right. The signature on the letters was a close copy, but it lacked the arrogant flourish of his true hand. A wave of disappointment went through Eliza. He had anticipated this, had a clerk sign them, giving himself a layer of deniability. The crowd began to murmur again, the tide of opinion swinging back in his favor. It was her word against his, and he was the man who signed their paychecks. It was then that a new voice spoke from the back of the room. It belonged to Miguel Ortega, the mail rider. He pushed his way forward, holding a dusty, leather-bound ledger. He addressed Dake, but his eyes were on the crowd. "I am a simple man. I carry the mail, and sometimes I carry freight for Mr. Crowley's station. This is my transport ledger. In it, I write down every crate, every barrel, what it is and where it goes, and for every shipment I deliver, I get a stamp in my book, a receipt from the station manager." He opened the book and laid it on the table. He pointed to an entry. 2 weeks ago, on the night of the raid on Station 17, I delivered a shipment of blasting powder. And here, he pointed to a circular stamp in purple ink, is my receipt, dated and marked with the official company seal. He then looked at Crowley. "The letters you hold in your hand. Mr. Crowley, they were mailed from Santa Fe. They would have been in a mail bag. A mail bag I delivered to your station that very night." He held up a small, brass seal. It was the official seal of the Trans-Western Freight Line, the same seal used to stamp his ledger. He pressed it onto a blank piece of paper, leaving a perfect impression. "Now, look at the wax seal on the back of those letters." Dake, confused, turned one of the letters over. There, on the back, was the same circular seal, pressed into the dark red wax. It was an insignificant detail, a bit of bureaucratic procedure, but it was an ironclad link. It proved that the letters had been at the station, in Crowley's possession, on the very night Eliza claimed to have taken them. It proved that Crowley's denial was a lie. The silence in the saloon was absolute. In that moment, the entire web of deceit unraveled. Every lie, from the fake ambush to the trumped-up charges against Hosa, was laid bare. The townspeople looked at each other, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and a slow, simmering anger. They had been played for fools. One of the miners, a big man named Peterson, who had been the most vocal in his calls for a lynching, stepped forward. He looked at Dake, his face hard as granite. "Marshal," he said, his voice a low growl, "I think we have heard enough. Take off that badge." Dake stared at him, his face slack with disbelief. His authority had vanished. He was no longer a lawman. He was just a bully without a mob to back him. His own deputies, the men who had followed him so blindly, now looked away, refusing to meet his eyes. Slowly, his hand trembling, Dake unpinned the tin star from his vest. It fell from his numb fingers and landed in the mud and sawdust on the floor, its cheap gleam extinguished. It was then that Crowley, seeing his empire of lies crumble into dust, finally broke, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure reptilian hatred. He was no longer a statesman. He was just a cornered animal. He lunged, but not for a weapon on the wall. He grabbed a pistol from the holster of a stunned deputy standing beside him. His movements were a blur of rage. He raised the gun, not at Hosa, not at Miguel, but at the source of all his trouble, at Eliza. Eliza saw the dark bore of the pistol swinging toward her, and for a second, the world seemed to slow down. She had a fleeting, absurd thought that it was not fair to have come this far only to have it end here, in the stink of stale beer. She did not see Kai move. He had been there all along, a shadow near the back door, waiting, trusting her to win the fight with words. But now, words had failed. He moved with a speed that was not quite human, covering the length of the room in 3 silent strides. He did not try to stop Crowley. He simply threw himself in front of Eliza. The gun exploded, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Kai grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, as the force of the bullet spun him around. He staggered, but did not fall, clutching his shoulder. A wave of pure, unthinking guilt washed over Eliza, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. He had been shot, for her, because of her. The saloon erupted into a new kind of chaos. Before Crowley could fire again, Peterson, the miner, slammed into him, bearing him to the ground. Other men piled on. Their collective rage finally unleashed. Dake, forgotten and alone, tried to slip out the back, but 2 of his former deputies grabbed him, their faces grim. The loyalty they had shown him was a thing of the past. Their loyalty was now to the town he had betrayed. The trial was over. Justice, in its own rough, chaotic way, had been served. But as Eliza rushed to Kai's side, pressing her hands to his bleeding shoulder, the only thing she felt was the cold, sickening fear that their victory had cost her the one thing she had finally realized she could not bear to lose. The gunshot in the saloon was not an ending, but a violent punctuation mark that separated the time of lies from the time of reckoning. In the chaotic aftermath, as the townsmen subdued a snarling, defeated Silas Crowley, Eliza's world narrowed to the space of a single man. Kai's wound was ugly, the bullet having torn through the muscle of his shoulder, but it had passed clean through, with Mercy Quinn directing her, her own hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. Eliza cleaned and dressed the wound, her touch a silent conversation of gratitude and terror. The town, having been pushed to the brink, did not fall back into its old ways, the shared shame of their gullibility, followed by the collective clarity of the truth, had forged a new, fragile sense of community. Crowley, in the confusion, managed to escape into the night, a snake slithering back into the shadows, but he had left his skin behind. The territorial authorities, summoned by a telegraph from the now cooperative station master, descended on Copper Gap. Faced with the mountain of evidence Jonas, Eliza, and Miguel provided, they seized all of Crowley's assets, his cattle, his mining claims, his contracts, his empire, built on fear, dissolved like a sandcastle in the rain. The railroad syndicate, fearing a scandal that would reach all the way to Washington, sent a new team of negotiators. They met not with a hunted chief in the wilderness, but with a recognized leader in the open. Jonas Reed, his integrity now his greatest asset, acted as the intermediary. The meetings were held on the prairie, under the wide, impartial sky. An agreement was reached, one that was not a treaty of surrender, but a pact of mutual respect. The railroad was rerouted along the more logical northern path. In exchange, the traditional migration routes of the Apache horses and the sanctity of their access to the headwaters of the creek were guaranteed in a formal, binding document. It was a victory won not with blood, but with ink and understanding. In the months that followed, as the wounds of the town and its people began to scar over, a new kind of life took root. Eliza, with funds from the sale of some of Crowley's confiscated property, purchased the old mercantile building. It was no longer a place of commerce, but a place of healing and learning. One half became a proper clinic, clean and well-stocked, with Mercy Quinn, her arm now healed, serving as its wise and respected consultant. The other half became a schoolhouse. In the mornings, She taught the town's children their letters and sums. In the afternoons, she held classes for the Apache women, teaching them English and modern hygiene, while they, in turn, taught her about the desert's pharmacopoeia, the healing properties of plants she had once seen as mere weeds. Hosa, his youthful fire now tempered by a quiet sense of purpose, became a bridge between the two worlds. He had seen the worst of the white man's law, but he had also seen the best of its people. He led hunting parties and taught the younger boys of his tribe not only the ancient ways of the warrior, but also the new way of the peacemaker. He was no longer just Kai's brother. He was a leader in his own right, his path forged in the fires of injustice and redemption. Kai recovered slowly. The physical wound healed, but the battle had left a deeper mark on him. He had lost a trusted elder, a man who had been like a father to him. He spent many weeks in the mountains, in silent communion with the land and the spirits of his ancestors. Eliza did not press him. She understood that his healing was his own journey. She tended to her clinic, taught her students, and waited, trusting in the quiet strength of the bond they had forged. He came for her one evening in the late fall, when the air was crisp, with the promise of winter, and the setting sun painted the prairie in hues of gold and rose. He did not come into the town, but waited for her at the edge of the grasslands, mounted on his favorite buckskin pony. He simply said, "Walk with me." She went without question, and they walked for a long time in a comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing. He led her to a place she had not seen before, a high, wind-swept knoll that overlooked the entire valley. In the center of the knoll was a large, circular arrangement of stones, some small, some as large as a man's chest. They were ancient, covered in lichen, and they hummed with a quiet, timeless energy. It was a sacred place, a place of ceremony. They stood in the center of the stone circle as the last light of day bled from the sky. A few of the Apache elders, including Tista, were waiting for them, their faces serene in the twilight. Kai turned to Eliza. His shoulder was healed, but he moved with a new, more deliberate grace. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a depth of emotion he had never allowed himself to show before. He said, "My life, before you, was about survival, about protecting what was left. You have shown me that it can be about building what is to come." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and firm. "In our world," he continued, his voice low and resonant, "there are no priests and no books of law to bind two people. A promise is made to the earth and to the sky and to the spirits of the ancestors who watch from these stones. It is a promise to share one another's burdens, to warm one another's hearth, and to walk the same path until our spirits are called home." He then did something that made Eliza's heart catch in her throat. He gently took the pins from her hair, letting it fall freely over her shoulders. He took the wooden comb, the one he had used that first night in his home, from a pouch at his belt. Slowly, reverently, he began to comb her hair, the familiar, soothing motion a silent echo of the care he had shown her when she was at her most vulnerable. When he was finished, he began to braid her hair, his strong, warrior's fingers surprisingly deft. He wove a single, brilliant blue feather into the braid, a feather from a mountain jay, a symbol of intelligence and faithfulness. When he was done, it was her turn. She reached up and touched the small leather pouch he wore around his neck, a medicine bundle that held sacred objects personal to him. He removed it and placed it in her hands. She opened it and saw a piece of polished turquoise, a flint arrowhead from his grandfather, and a dried desert flower. With a piece of new sinew, she added a small, smooth silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Inside it was nothing, just a space to be filled with new memories. She tied the pouch back around his neck, her fingers lingering for a moment against the warmth of his skin. It was an exchange, not of property, but of history, of identity. He took both of her hands in his. His gaze was unwavering, his voice a solemn vow. "Eliza Hart, healer and builder, my heart walks with you." She looked into his eyes and saw her future, a future she had never dared to imagine. It would not be an easy life, but it would be a real one, grounded in love and shared purpose. "I am honored to walk that path with you, Kai," she replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "My heart is your home." The elders began a low, rhythmic chant, a song of blessing that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. It was a song of rain and sun, of hardship and endurance, of the enduring power of two souls choosing to become one. It was a marriage of the prairie and the mountain, of the healer and the warrior, a love born not in the soft light of a parlor, but in the harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving light of the high desert. The years flowed like water over stones, smoothing the sharp edges of memory and carving new patterns on the land. By the late 1880s, the raw outpost of Copper Gap had softened into a town. The iron rails of the Transwestern, the very ones that had once been a harbinger of war, now brought a steady stream of commerce and new faces. The daily arrival of the train was a civic ritual, and its whistle, once a sound of intrusion, was now a familiar promise of connection to the wider world. Inside the new train station, a modest but proud wooden structure that smelled of fresh lumber and coal smoke, hung a large photograph. It was a portrait of the town, taken the previous summer by an itinerant photographer with a wagon full of glass plates and chemicals. It was a remarkable image, not for its technical artistry, but for its subjects. In the center stood Eliza and Kai, their hands not touching but linked by an invisible current of deep, settled affection. Eliza's hair was braided with a single blue feather, now a familiar part of her attire. Kai stood tall, a leader not of a hunted band, but of a respected community, his eyes holding the quiet wisdom of a man who had chosen peace over war. On either side of them were their two children, a boy of 10 with his father's searching eyes and his mother's gentle mouth, and a girl of 8, her face a perfect, spirited blend of them both. Surrounding the central family was the rest of their world, a gray-haired Mercy Quinn, her back a little more stooped but her gaze as sharp as ever. Jonas Reed, now the railroad's regional supervisor, stood with his wife and their own children. Hosa was there, a handsome man in his prime, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a young Apache woman, and woven throughout the crowd were the faces of miners, ranchers, and Apache families, all standing together, their initial suspicion of one another worn away by years of shared hardship and common purpose. They were no longer two peoples living in opposition, but one community living in a hard-won, imperfect, but genuine peace. The ghosts of the past still lingered, but they had lost their power. Word had trickled back a few years prior that Silas Crowley had been arrested in a different territory, not for murder or inciting violence, but for a common swindler's crime of land fraud. His end came not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a cell door, his vast ambitions reduced to a criminal footnote in a dusty ledger. As for Marshall Dake, his fate was a more immediate and pathetic one. He was last seen working as a guard for a cheap mining operation far to the south, a bitter, broken man whose only authority was a shotgun and the contempt of the men he oversaw. On a windy afternoon, with the sky washed clean by a recent shower, Eliza sat with her daughter, Anawa, on the porch of the home they had built together, a sturdy adobe house a little ways from town, where the prairie met the foothills. Anawa, which meant turtle in the Apache tongue, was a child of both worlds, as comfortable with a book in her lap as she was on the back of a pony. She was brushing the tangled mane of a wooden horse her brother had carved for her. Eliza watched her for a moment, a wave of love so fierce it almost took her breath away. She went inside and returned with the wooden comb, its surface now gleaming with the patina of age and use. She sat down behind Anawa and began to gently work through her long, dark hair. Anawa leaned back into her mother's touch. "Tell me the story again, Mama, the story of the comb." Eliza smiled. It was their ritual, a story as much a part of their family as the stone circle on the knoll or the lullabies Kai sang in his own language. "A long time ago, she began, her voice soft. The world was a very loud place, full of fear and dust. I was lost in a storm of sand and a storm of lies. I was tired, and I was sick, and I was very much alone. Your father found me. He brought me to his home, a safe place hidden in the rocks. She continued the story, her hands moving in the familiar, rhythmic motion. She told of the fever and the fear and the profound exhaustion that had settled into her bones. And then, when I was at my weakest, when I felt like a stranger in a strange land, he took this very comb and he began to brush my hair. It was a mess, full of dust and tangles, but he was so patient, and as he smoothed my hair, it felt like he was smoothing the fear from my heart. Anawa was quiet, listening intently. Then he said the words. Eliza murmured, her voice barely a whisper, as if sharing a sacred secret. He said, "You sleep in my bed tonight." She paused, letting the weight of the memory settle in the quiet afternoon air. She set the comb down and gently turned her daughter to face her, taking the child's small hands in her own. "Now, some people," she said, looking directly into her daughter's eyes, "might hear those words and think they were the words of a man taking something, a man claiming ownership. But your father, he was not saying, 'You belong to me.' He was saying, 'You are safe with me.' He was not offering a bed for a night. He was offering a home for a lifetime. He was offering a place where I would be respected, where my spirit could heal. It was the kindest, most honorable thing anyone had ever said to me." She placed the wooden comb in Anawa's hands. "This comb," she said, "is a reminder that true strength is not in a loud voice or a heavy hand. It is in the quiet courage to care for another person. It is in the promise to build a home together. That is the legacy he gave to me, and it is the one we give to you." Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Kai returned from the mountains. He came and stood behind Eliza's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. Their children ran to greet him. They stood there for a moment, a family framed against the vast, beautiful landscape, their shared glances speaking of a love that had been tested by fire and flood, and had endured. The sound of the church bell still echoed in the memory of the town, a reminder of the day they chose community over chaos. The circle of stones on the knoll still stood, a testament to a promise made to the earth. The red dust still rose from the trail, but it was no longer a symbol of division and old blood. It was simply the land, breathing, a land that now held the story of their lives. A quiet testament to the enduring truth that justice is not a thing you find, but a thing you build, with courage, with evidence, and with a love that is brave enough to offer shelter from the storm. Thank you for listening to our story, and we invite you to comment with where you are listening from so everyone can connect and share their thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.